I never thought my life would turn into something I wanted to escape. 15 years of marriage, 2 beautiful children, a house with a white picket fence, wasn't this supposed to be the dream? On the outside, I had it all. On the inside, I was drowning in silence. David and I weren't always like this. In the early years, we were inseparable. We talked for hours, touched each other just because, and laughed at things no one else found funny. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Maybe it was after Liam was born, when sleep became a luxury and time alone a distant memory. Maybe it was when David's career took off, and I became the person who kept everything running at home. Or maybe it was when I started getting tired, so damn tired, and David just assumed I was lazy. I told myself this was normal. Marriage isn't always exciting. Love isn't always passionate. But there's a difference between comfortable silence and suffocating loneliness. The weight of silence. Every morning, I woke up before everyone else. I made breakfast. I packed lunches. I signed school forms and wiped sticky counters. David would get ready for work, scrolling through his phone, answering emails before he even said, "Good morning." Sometimes, he'd kiss my cheek on his way out. Other times, he'd just grab his coffee and leave. The house was loud with the kids, but inside, I was alone. I tried to talk to him about it once. "I just feel like we don't connect anymore," I had said one night, after the kids were in bed. "Like we're just existing next to each other." David sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm exhausted. Can we not do this right now?" So I didn't. And that became our pattern, me reaching out, him pulling away. It was easier to say nothing than to beg for attention. The warning signs. At first, I ignored the exhaustion. Every mom is tired, right? But this was different. It was bone deep, a fatigue that clung to me no matter how much I rested. Some days, my hands ached so badly I could barely grip a coffee mug. Other days, I felt like my brain was wrapped in fog, making it hard to think. I told David. "I think something's wrong with me." He barely looked up from his laptop. "You just need to get more sleep." I stopped talking about it. But my body didn't stop failing me. One evening, after a long day of errands, cooking, cleaning, and refereeing sibling fights, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the dishes piled in the sink. My heart was racing, my legs felt like lead, and a sharp pain shot through my chest. I closed my eyes, gripping the counter. "Breathe, Emily. Just breathe." Then everything went dark. The collapse. I woke up on the cold tile floor, the sound of Sophie crying somewhere in the distance. "Mommy? Mommy, wake up." Liam was shaking my arm. My vision blurred as I tried to sit up. My head throbbed. My limbs felt like they didn't belong to me. "David!" Liam shouted. "Daddy, something's wrong with Mommy." Footsteps pounded toward me. Then David was there, standing over me, his face tight with frustration. "What the hell, Em?" His voice wasn't worried. It was irritated. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. He sighed, rubbing his jaw. "You scared the kids." I wanted to scream. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't touch me, didn't pull me into his arms, and say he was scared. He just looked, inconvenienced. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, something inside me cracked. I wasn't just exhausted. I wasn't just overwhelmed. I was alone. And I wasn't sure I could do this anymore. The morning after I collapsed, I woke up feeling like my body had betrayed me. My limbs ached, my head was heavy, and a dull soreness throbbed in my chest. But the real pain wasn't physical. It was the memory of David's face, his frustration instead of fear, his indifference instead of concern. I turned my head toward him. He was already awake, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. "You okay?" he asked, without looking at me. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I don't know." He nodded. "Probably just stress." That was it. No discussion, no follow-up. A part of me wanted to scream, I passed out in the kitchen, David. But I didn't. Because deep down, I already knew, if I had to beg for him to care, it wouldn't mean anything. So I got up, ignored the lingering dizziness, and started another day. A name for the pain. A week later, I sat in a cold doctor's office, staring at the faded anatomy posters on the wall. I had almost cancelled the appointment. What was the point? But when I nearly blacked out again while grocery shopping, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Dr. Patel walked in, holding a clipboard. She was kind, the kind of doctor who actually looked you in the eye when she spoke. "We got your test results back," she said. "You have an autoimmune disorder. It explains the fatigue, the pain, the dizziness." My breath caught in my throat. "An autoimmune disorder?" She nodded. "Your immune system is attacking your body. It's why you're feeling like this. It's chronic, but manageable with the right treatment." I should have felt relief, at least I had an answer. But all I felt was a crushing weight. Chronic. That meant forever. I walked out of the office in a daze, clutching a folder full of information I didn't want to read. My first instinct was to call David, to tell him, I have a reason for feeling this way. I'm not making it up. But then I remembered the way he looked at me that night on the kitchen floor. And I didn't call him at all. The loneliness of sickness. That evening, I told him over dinner. The kids were in the living room watching TV, their laughter floating through the house while I sat across from my husband, staring at a man who felt more like a stranger. "They found something," I said, pushing my food around my plate. "It's an autoimmune disorder." David barely reacted. "What does that mean?" "It means my body is attacking itself. It's why I've been so exhausted." I searched his face, hoping for something: concern, sympathy, even just curiosity. He frowned. "So, what do you do for it?" "There's treatment, but no cure." He took a sip of his beer. "Well, at least you know now." I waited. Waited for him to ask how I felt, if I was scared, if I needed anything from him. He never did. Instead, he changed the subject. Something about work, a meeting that got rescheduled. I don't even remember. All I know is that I sat there, nodding along, feeling like a ghost in my own home. The quiet resentment. The weeks that followed blurred together. I started treatment, but the side effects hit hard. My joints ached, my hands trembled, and the fatigue never really went away. The house still needed cleaning, the kids still needed me, and David still acted like nothing had changed. One night, I asked him to put the kids to bed because I was too exhausted to move. He sighed, but he did it. The next day, he made a comment under his breath. "I guess everything's on me now." Something inside me snapped. "Are you serious?" My voice was sharp, unfamiliar even to me. "Do you think I want to feel like this? Do you think I enjoy not being able to keep up?" He looked up from his laptop, startled. "That's not what I meant." "But it's what you think." I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "God, David, do you even see me anymore? Do you even care?" His jaw tightened. "Of course I care, Emily. But I can't fix this for you." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "I don't need you to fix it. I just need you to be here." He said nothing. Just turned back to his screen. That was the moment I realized something awful. I wasn't just sick. I was alone. And maybe I had been for a long time. I used to believe that affairs only happened to people who were unhappy. The kind of people who fought all the time, who slept in separate rooms, who hated each other but stayed together out of obligation. That wasn't me. I wasn't unhappy, I was lonely. And loneliness does things to you. It makes you crave something, anything, to remind you that you're still alive. I didn't go looking for it. I wasn't scrolling through old contacts, searching for someone to fill the void my husband left. It just happened. And it happened with someone I never expected. A familiar name. It started with a Facebook message. Hey, Emily. Long time no see. I stared at the name on my screen, my heart skipping a beat. Daniel Whitaker. We had gone to high school together. Back then, he was the boy every girl had a crush on, tall, confident, always cracking jokes in the back of class. We had been friends, nothing more, but there was always something unspoken between us. Oh, what if we never explored? I hadn't thought about him in years. But there he was, his profile picture showing the same easy smile, only now with a few lines around his eyes. I hesitated before typing back. Hey, Daniel. Wow, it's been forever. That was all it took. A simple message turned into a conversation. A conversation turned into late-night chats. Late-night chats turned into something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to name. Because naming it would make it real. The gray area. Daniel wasn't married. He had been, but it ended in divorce. He told me he had 2 kids, that he worked in finance, that life wasn't what he expected, but he was making the best of it. I told him about my autoimmune disorder, about how exhausted I was all the time. I told him about David, not everything, but enough for him to understand. And Daniel listened. Not in the way David did, with half his attention elsewhere. Daniel really listened. He asked questions. He remembered details. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I told myself it was harmless. We weren't doing anything wrong. It was just talking. Just reminiscing. Just filling the silence that had settled into my marriage like an unwanted guest. But then the messages started to change. I think about you a lot, Emily. I stared at the words on my screen, my heart pounding. I should have stopped. I should have shut it down, reminded him, and myself, that I was married. But instead, I typed back. I think about you too. The guilt and the thrill. I knew what I was doing was wrong, even if I never admitted it. I started checking my phone constantly, waiting for his messages. I smiled more. I felt lighter. I felt wanted. David noticed the change. One night, as I was getting into bed, he frowned at me. You've been on your phone a lot lately. I froze, my fingers tightening around the device. Just talking to an old friend. He didn't press further. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he just didn't want to know. But I cared. I told myself I wasn't cheating. I hadn't kissed him, hadn't touched him. But I wanted to. And wasn't that worse? Wasn't the worst betrayal the one that happened in your heart? The discovery. It all came crashing down on a quiet Tuesday night. I was washing dishes when I heard David's voice behind me, low and cold. Who the hell is Daniel? I turned, my stomach twisting into knots. He was holding my phone. My heart stopped. I had been careless. I forgot to delete the messages. And now they were there, in his hands, proof of the part of me he had ignored for years. David. He threw the phone onto the counter. Don't. His voice was shaking. How long? I swallowed hard. A few months. His laugh was hollow. A few months. Jesus, Emily. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. Did you sleep with him? No. He looked at me then, his blue eyes burning into mine. But you wanted to. I couldn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. The aftermath. That night, David slept on the couch. The next morning, he barely spoke to me. I had spent years begging him to notice me, to see me. And now that he finally did, it was for all the wrong reasons. David didn't yell. He didn't throw anything or demand answers. That was almost worse. I had expected rage, accusations, something loud and messy. But instead, the house was filled with an unbearable silence, the kind that choked the air, heavy and suffocating. He barely looked at me. Barely spoke. And for the first time in a long time, I was the one begging for his attention. Living with a ghost. The morning after he found the messages, David woke up before me, which was unusual. He showered, got dressed, and left for work without a word. I waited all day for a message, a call, something. But my phone stayed silent. That night, when he came home, I tried to talk to him. David, can we just? Not now. The days turned into a painful routine. He avoided me, kept conversations short and cold. He still kissed the kids goodnight, still went to work, still took out the trash on Thursdays like always. But there was no us anymore. We had become two strangers sharing the same house. The inevitable conversation. A week later, I couldn't take it anymore. We were in the kitchen, me washing dishes, him scrolling through his phone at the table. It felt so normal, and yet nothing was normal at all. I turned off the water, dried my hands, and took a deep breath. Are you going to punish me forever? He didn't even flinch. Just kept staring at his screen. I don't know how else to feel, Emily. His voice was quiet, but it cut through me. I'm sorry, I whispered. I never meant to cheat? He finally looked up, his eyes cold. Because that's what it was. Tears burned at my eyes. I didn't sleep with him. David scoffed. Oh, come on. That doesn't matter, and you know it. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. You didn't have to sleep with him, Em. You chose him over me in every other way. I swallowed hard. I didn't feel like I had a choice. His jaw tightened. You did. You could have talked to me. I let out a bitter laugh. I did talk to you. 4 years, David. And you didn't listen. Silence. For a second, I thought I had gotten through to him. But then he stood up, grabbing his car keys. Where are you going? My voice cracked. I need air. And then he was gone. Old wounds, new scars. I sat at the table long after he left, staring at the spot where he had been. How did we get here? How did we become this? I used to think love was unbreakable, that marriage, real marriage, could survive anything. But the truth was, love could break. And once it did, the cracks never really went away. I thought about calling Daniel. The habit was still there, that need for comfort. But I didn't. Instead, I let the loneliness sink in. I had been avoiding it for years, distracting myself with the kids, the house, my sickness, and finally, him. But now, sitting alone in the dim kitchen, I had no one to run to. It was just me. And maybe that was the scariest part. I once read that the hardest part of marriage isn't falling in love, it's deciding, over and over, to stay. For 15 years, I had chosen David. Through exhaustion, through loneliness, through sickness. Even when I felt invisible, even when I wanted to give up, I stayed. But now, for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could anymore. The unspoken question. David didn't come home that night. He wasn't the kind of man to disappear, not without an explanation. He was steady, predictable. The kind of person who always did what he was supposed to. But this? This was different. I sat awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Every creak, every shift in the air, made my chest tighten. Would he come back? Would he walk in and pretend nothing happened? Or would he sit me down and say the words I wasn't ready to hear? I didn't sleep. At dawn, just as the sky started to lighten, I heard the front door open. David. I stayed in bed, heart pounding as his footsteps moved through the house. He paused outside our bedroom. For a second, I thought he might come in. Might climb into bed, pull me close, and tell me everything would be okay. But then he kept walking. The guest room door opened. Closed. And just like that, I had my answer. The hard truth. The next morning, we moved through the house like strangers. The kids noticed, of course, they weren't blind. Liam asked, "Why is Dad sleeping in the guest room?" I forced a smile. "He's just really tired, sweetheart." Sophie frowned. Are you and Daddy mad at each other? I hesitated. A little. Liam looked at me with those big, serious eyes. Are you going to get divorced? The question punched the air from my lungs. I had no answer. Because I didn't know. Facing the inevitable. That night, after the kids were asleep, I stood outside the guest room door. My hands were shaking as I knocked. David's voice was flat. Yeah? I opened the door. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. We can't keep doing this, I said softly. He let out a tired laugh. No. We can't. I stepped inside. So, what now? For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, finally, he looked at me. Do you still love me? He asked. The question hit me like a freight train. Because the answer wasn't simple. I did love him. I always had. But love wasn't the problem. It was everything else, the neglect, the distance, the years of feeling unseen. I don't know, I whispered. Do you still love me? David sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. I don't know either. And there it was. The truth we had both been avoiding. Maybe love wasn't enough. The decision. We sat in silence, the weight of 15 years pressing down on us. David was the first to speak. I don't want to fight anymore. Me neither. He looked up at me, searching my face. Do you want to stay? Tears blurred my vision. I thought about our life, the house, the kids, the years we had built together. I thought about the nights I had begged for his attention, the way my heart had reached for something he wouldn't give. I thought about Daniel, about the person I had become, about the person I wanted to be. And for the first time, I let myself ask the question I had been too afraid to face. What if leaving didn't mean giving up? What if leaving meant saving myself? I took a shaky breath. I don't think I can. David didn't look surprised. Maybe he had known all along. He nodded, his throat bobbing. Then we figure it out. A tear slipped down my cheek. Okay. The bittersweet goodbye. We didn't end in flames. There was no dramatic fight, no screaming accusations. Just two people who had loved each other once, sitting in a quiet room, accepting that love wasn't always enough. A month later, David moved into an apartment nearby. We told the kids together, promising them we would always be a family, no matter what. It hurt. God, it hurt. But in a strange way, it also felt like I could breathe again. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to notice me. For the first time, I was choosing myself. And that was its own kind of love. The end.